I'm actually not going to talk about everybody because there isn't time and it gets too complex. But what I'm going to do is go through the four principal navies that we need to worry about, which is Germany, France, Italy, and the United States. So starting off with the Imperial German Navy. The destroyer designs process in the Imperial German Navy closely parallel that initially prevalent in the Royal Navy. The Navy laid down basic parameters for size, armament, and performance, and generated an outline design, then allowed the individual yards to create their own final designs for production. However, unlike the Royal Navy, which by and large moved to generating standardized designs in-house from 1908, the German Navy continued the practice of allowing individual yards quite a degree of leeway when producing their final designs throughout the period of its existence until 1918. One consequence of this practice is that many writers on the topic of German destroyers tend to describe them as belonging to a multitude of classes, when in fact there were only a few prior to 1914. All destroyers belonged to the models 1906, 1911, and 1913. Within each model, the builder was identified with each yard's initial preceding this sequential number, G for Germania-Werft, S for Schickau, and V for Vulcan. It is important to note that the Navy classified all these destroyers as high seas torpedo boats or large torpedo boats and not as destroyers. Their primary role was torpedo attack with defense against enemy torpedo craft as secondary mission. This perspective had important consequences. In general, gun armament was lighter and torpedo outfit heavier than that of many contemporary destroyers of other navies. Freeboard tended to be less than others, and the characteristic well between the forecastle and the bridge gave them a distinct silhouette. Contemporary records confirmed this well was notoriously wet in a seaway, sufficiently so to make it difficult to operate the torpedo tubes mounted within it. Nevertheless, this feature was retained throughout this period, apparently because the forward mounting of these torpedo tubes was thought to allow firing them ahead during an attack. The 60 model 1906 boats represented an incremental improvement upon the previous model 1898 vessels. They were approximately 20% larger, and the greater tonnage allowed for the installation of a much more powerful machinery, an average of 15,000 horsepower versus the 7,000 horsepower of the earlier boats. All but the early model 1906 boats were turbine engines and could reach 33 knots, 5 knots faster than their precursors. Boats built from 1908 onwards used mixed firing for their boilers, 3 being coal-fired and 1 oil-fired. Range was about 1,000 miles at 17 knots. Gun armament was light. The initial boats carried 1 8.8 centimeter gun and 3 5.2 centimeter weapons. Later boats carried 2 8.8 centimeter guns, and the earlier boats were later rearmed similarly. Early boats had a single 50 centimeter torpedo tube in the well and 2 50 centimeter tubes aft in the characteristic German V-mount in which the 2 tubes diverged. Later boats fitted a twin mount in the well instead of the single tube. The model 1906 boats were regarded as quite good sea boats for their size, but rolled heavily and were very susceptible to wind and waves from a beam. The well forward and low freeboard made them very wet in anything of a seaway. The model 1911 boats, 24 of which were built, were very similar to their precursors. Their machinery and power plants were essentially the same and generated a similar performance. They carried the same armament as the later model 1906 boats. Despite these similarities, these boats had inferior seakeeping qualities, and it was found that the well was a particularly severe problem. As a result, the last of Vulcan's model 1911 boats, V6, which is this one here, was constructed with the forecastle extending to the back of the bridge, and the two single torpedo tubes were mounted on either side behind the break of the forecastle. The model 1913 boats represented a substantial leap in size. Displacement increased from around 750 tons to approximately 1,100 tons. Greater displacement required more powerful machinery, 25,000 horsepower rather than 15,000 horsepower. But all the boats were capable of 34 to 36 knots. 3 oil-fired boilers were standard. Greater size allowed for increased armament. Initial boats carried 3 8.8 centimeter guns and 6 50-centimeter torpedo tubes, 2 single mounts in the well forward between the forecastle and the bridge, and the others on 2 twin mounts. From mid-1916, all new boats and most of the earlier vessels of the type were rearmed with 3 10.5 centimeter guns. That's pretty much a 4-inch gun. Despite the experience gained from V6, both Schickau and Vulcan reverted to the arrangement with a well between the forecastle and the bridge for their boats. Garnier, however, fitted all their, this is Garnier's example here, fitted all their boats with a long forecastle and tubes mounted abaft the break. During the war, the Model 1913 design was revived and put in production as the Model 1906 mobilization. These boats were almost identical to the Model 1913 boats, but all of them were fitted with the extended forecastle. A radical shift in German design philosophy occurred with the advent of the Model 1914 type. These were the first to be officially designated Zerstörer, destroyers. Prior to the war, Vulcan and Garnier had been developing large destroyers to fulfill export orders, although Vulcan had acted more in a consultative role in developing the Russian Novik type, which I'm sure that Mark will talk to you at length about. On the outbreak of war, Blom and Voss had machinery contracts with Russia for large destroyers and approached the Navy about using these engines in similar destroyers for Germany. The Model 1914 boats were all about 60% larger than any previous German boats, at about 1,850 tons. Their engines developed 40,000 horsepower, sufficient for the boats to attain 36 knots. 4 oil-fired boilers provided steam to the turbines, and over 500 tons of oil gave the boats a range of close to 2,500 miles at 20 knots. Armament initially was very light, 4 8.8 centimeter guns and 6 50-centimeter torpedo tubes. But from about mid-1916, 10.5 centimeter weapons replaced the 8.8 centimeter weapons 1 for 1. Apparently it worked great. You would have thought there would have been a stability issue, but they didn't have a problem with this. Once again, the characteristic well between the forecastle and the bridge, here and here, was fitted and retained, and 2 of the tubes were mounted there. You can see them here and here. The fleet regarded these destroyers to be excellent sea boats, but the British considered them much inferior to the V-class destroyers on the basis of observing B-98, which underway because on many occasions, because B-98 was the mail boat for the interned high seas fleet and had to be escorted across from Germany to Scapa. The final design of destroyers for the Kaiserliche Marine were the Model 1916 boats, only 2 of which, S112 and V116, were completed. These were huge 2,400-ton vessels driven by 56,000 horsepower turbines, good for 36 knots. 700 tons of oil gave them a range of 2,500 miles at 20 knots. Armament, too, was impressive. 4 15 centimeters okay, 6-inch or 5.9-inch guns, and 4 60 centimeters, a new size for the Germans, torpedo tubes in 2 power-operated twin mounts. After the war, S-113 went to France as Amiral Saint and V-116 to Italy as Premuda. The Germans highly regarded these boats, although they only had 4 or 5 months of operational experience. I've not found much information about Italy's experience with Premuda, but the French were rather less enthusiastic about Amiral Saint, which they found to be overloaded and unstable. Now we move on to the Marine Nationale, which is even now, 200 and some years after the revolution, called La Royale. French destroyer development lagged behind that of most naval powers in the years before World War I, which is a surprising contrast to their success in developing torpedo boats at the end of the 19th century. Essentially, French destroyers of this period fell into 2 groups: a series of boats about 500 tons with flush decks, and a second series of 800-ton boats with raised forecastles. The flush-decked boats were essentially enlarged versions of earlier destroyers. The Bouclier-class, this is an example here, retained triple expansion engines of about 7,500 horsepower, drawing steam from coal-fired boilers to attain 28 knots. Gun armament was 6 6.5 centimeter guns and 3 45 centimeter torpedo tubes, one of which was mounted fixed in the bow firing forward. Very old-fashioned. 2 experimental vessels made up the Bouclier-class, which was very similar to the Bouclier-class, but had mixed machinery, a triple expansion engine driving a central shaft, flanked by 2 turbines driving the outer shaft. This arrangement proved quite successful in service, but the mix of machinery made for complex maintenance issues. The final flush deck destroyers, the Chasseur-class, used triple turbines, and all but the named ship were oil-fired. These boats were very successful. Their machinery developed as much as 9,000 horsepower and drove them to as much as 33 knots. Armament for all the flush deck destroyers remained unchanged, and their guns were too light to be effective. The 800-ton class type destroyers introduced a raised forecastle and twin turbine engines generating 13 to 15,000 horsepower. All were oil-fired and capable of 30 knots. Armament was improved to 2 10-centimeter guns, 4 6.5 centimeter guns, and 4 45 centimeter torpedo tubes. The 20 boats of the Bouclier, Bisson, and Ensign classes were quite successful, especially in the Mediterranean, where weather conditions tended to be better. The outbreak of war brought most French naval construction to a halt. The only additions to the destroyer fleet were 4 large 1,250-ton boats under construction for Argentina, which were requisitioned and put into service as the Aventurier-class, and 12 boats of the Arabe-class, built by Japanese shipyards to the Imperial Japanese Navy's Kaba-class design. The Aventurier-class boats were heavily armed with 4 4-inch guns and 6 18-inch torpedo tubes. They had these sizes because they actually had American weapons being built for Argentina. This actually caused a lot of problems during the war because they didn't have the right ammunition for them. Their machinery was very unreliable, so that by 1917, speed had been reduced from 30 knots to 22 knots. The Arab-class boats, in contrast, were very successful. The Japanese yards built all of them, all 12 of them, in just over 5 months, from keel laying to completion. They carried 1 4.7-inch gun, 3 3-inch guns, and 2 45-centimeter torpedo tubes. It was rather odd. The 4.7s and the 3-inch were Japanese/British weapons. The torpedo tubes were French. 3 triple expansion engines produced 10,000 horsepower, good for 29 knots. And they had 2 coal-fired and 2 oil-fired boilers. These were very successful boats. They actually stayed in service well into the 1930s. The principal design yard for destroyers in Italy was Paterson in Naples. Since this firm was largely owned by Thornycroft, it is no surprise that Italian destroyers of this period strongly resembled their British counterparts. The dominant type was the Indomito class of 1912. The initial design was a 700-ton boat powered by 2 turbines, generating 16,000 horsepower to drive the destroyer at 30 knots. Armament was 1 12-centimeter gun, 4 7.5-centimeter guns, and 2 45-centimeter torpedo tubes. Paterson built 6 of this class, while 2 almost identical boats of the Ardito class came from Orlando in Livorno. Orlando also built 2 boats of the Audace class, fitted with Zoeli turbines, which was a Swiss design, instead of Parsons machinery. Initially, these were faster than the other Indomito type boats, reaching 36 knots in trials, but the turbines proved unreliable and performance degraded rapidly. An almost identical series was ordered in 1914, the 8 boats of the Pilo class. The principal difference was removing the 12-centimeter gun, rearranging the 7.5-centimeter weapons, and adding 2 7.5-centimeter anti-aircraft guns, a response to the increasing threat from Austro-Hungarian naval aircraft in the confined waters of the Adriatic. Odero in Sesti then developed and built 2 series of an enlarged version of the Indomito design. Displacement increased to 850 tons, accompanied by a slight increase in power to 17,000 horsepower, which was sufficient for some boats to attain 33 knots. The principal change was to the armament. The 4 boats of the Sertori class received 6 10.2-centimeter 35 caliber guns, 2 40-millimeter anti-aircraft weapons, and 4 45-centimeter tubes in twin nuts. The 8 boats of the La Masa class, this is one of them here, these were the last ones from World War I, were identical except for the gun armament, which was 4 10.2 45 caliber guns and 2 7.6-centimeter anti-aircraft guns. The Regia Marina continued to order and build more of this same general type, but all were delivered several years after 1918. United States Navy. Okay, so if anybody wants to make a complaint about the number of stars.
Stars, yes.
There are 48 stars until 1959. So this is the flag pertinent to our period. The United States Navy's first destroyers, delivered in the early 1900s, largely resembled contemporary British 30-knotters in size, armament, and performance. Approximately half of them had a raised forecastle, the others a turtleback. Their successors in 3 classes were a considerable advance over the early boats, although peculiarly quite sometime later, they, instead of being thought of as big destroyers, they were called flivvers, which was really a derogatory expression for them being small. Displacement jumped from about 400 tons to over 700 tons. The Smith class was powered by Parsons turbine, developing 10,000 horsepower, giving a top speed of 28 knots. The succeeding Pauling and Monaghan classes had 12,000 horsepower for 29.5 knots. Armament was 5 3-inch guns and 3 18-inch tubes for the Smith class. The torpedo armament was doubled for the others by fitting twin mounts, and the earlier boats were later rearmed to match. This was the precursor of a characteristic of US destroyers right the way up until just prior to World War II, which was they tended to mount a lot of torpedo tubes. The most significant difference when compared with European destroyers was their range of up to 3,000 miles at 16 knots, reflecting the country's geographical location. The next four classes were much larger displacement. It rose to a little over 1,000 tons. The Cassin and O'Brien classes were powered by twin turbines developing 16,000 horsepower, with auxiliary triple expansion engines on each shaft for cruising, which was good for about 15 knots and could attain 29 knots. The two later classes omitted these triple expansion engines and were fitted with cruising turbines instead. Range was 2,500 miles at 20 knots. Armament was 4 4-inch guns and 8 18-inch torpedo tubes on twin mounts for the Cassin class. The O'Brien and Tucker classes carried 21-inch torpedo tubes, while the final 1,000-tonners, the Samson class, were fitted with triple mounts for 12 21-inch torpedo tubes. The Samson class also received 2 1-pounder, which is 40mm pom-poms. The prototypes for the famous flush deckers were the Caldwell-class destroyers. The idea behind this new design was to maintain the same freeboard at the bow and stern, but to join the two parts with 2 points with a flush deck, thus increasing strength without adding much weight. The increased strength comes because you don't have a break in the forecastle. Machinery was similar to that on previous boats, with output increased slightly to 18,500 horsepower, allowing a top speed of 30 knots. Armament duplicated that of the Samson class, 4 4-inch and 12 21-inch torpedo tubes. But it had an addition of a Y gun, which is a peculiar depth charge thrower. Basically looks like a Y, fires one charge off to forward and one to starboard. Essentially, the same design was put into mass production as part of the massive 1916 construction program, but very few of the Wicks class were completed before the end of World War I. The intent of the flush deck design was to reduce rolling and pitching and produce a stronger hull by eliminating the forecastle break. To keep weight down, the draft was also reduced slightly to compensate for increased beam. In the event, the flush deckers were worse sea boats than their precursors. They rolled more, they were much wetter, and the shallower draft reduced propeller performance, so that they had to be trimmed by the stern to immerse the propellers properly. Since the design was put into mass production before all these problems became apparent, the United States Navy found itself stuck with over 250 destroyers that it could not replace with more efficient units until the mid-1930s. That's it.